We let our guard down, where we should feel safest behind locked doors, in familiar yards, under humming porch lights. But sometimes, the threat isn't a stranger in the dark. It's the person next door. How well do you really know the people living closest to you? The barbed wire knock. This story comes from Daniel, and it's one of those rare moments where a mother's instinct spared his entire family from a nightmare that could have turned all too real. Daniel was only 7 years old when it happened. So much of what you'll hear comes from his mother, Sarah. This happened when Daniel's family lived in a pretty rough neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta. The houses were close together, but the people kept to themselves, or worse, they didn't. Sarah hated the area. It wasn't the kind of place where you could leave your doors unlocked, and they had one specific neighbor who always gave her the worst feeling in her stomach. He was a middle-aged guy, quiet, unfriendly, and she'd caught him more than once just standing behind his sheer curtains, staring directly at her family's house. The dad, Michael, traveled a lot for his job. Sarah was used to being alone with the 3 young kids, but she never liked it. It made the house feel too big, too quiet, and too vulnerable. It was just past midnight on a Tuesday. The house was dead quiet. Michael was 1,000 miles away, the kids were asleep, and Sarah had finally drifted off. Then the knocking started. It wasn't a demanding knock, more like a tentative tap. Rap, rap, rap. Sarah bolted upright in bed, immediately disoriented. Who the hell knocks at midnight? She waited, listening to the heavy silence settle back in the house. When it didn't happen again, she slowly swung her legs over the side of the bed, grabbing the robe from the chair. She walked quietly down the hall, passing the kids' rooms, her heart starting to beat a little faster. She reached the front door and cleared her throat. Who is it? Nothing. No voice, no footsteps, just the sound of crickets outside and the slight hum of the streetlights. She peered through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty. Okay, just some punk kids playing ding-dong ditch, she told herself. It was annoying, but not terrifying. She walked back to the bedroom, lay down, and tried to calm her pulse. She'd been back in bed for maybe 30 minutes, drifting on the edge of sleep when it started again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't a tap. It was a loud, deliberate thump, thump, thump that rattled the doorframe. Sarah shot out of bed. This was too late for kids, and the sound had malice in it. She crept down the hall, not daring to turn on a light. She eased up to the door and pressed her face against the small, narrow side window, trying to see the porch. The porch light was off, and the darkness was heavy. Again, she saw nothing. Nobody was standing there. Yet she heard a soft scuff sound, like a shoe shifting weight just beyond the door. It wasn't the sound of a person running away. It was the sound of a person waiting. The blood went cold in her veins. In a neighborhood like this, you didn't assume harmless pranks. You assumed the worst possible scenario. Sarah silently backed away from the door. She didn't check the peephole again. She knew someone was out there and they were deliberately hiding from the side view. She walked back to the master bedroom, her mind racing. She was 3 miles from the police station, and she had 3 sleeping children. She went to the closet and pulled out Michael's Remington 870 shotgun. It felt heavy and cold in her hands, a dark, immediate reality check. She checked the safety, carried it back to the living room, and sat down on the sofa, keeping her back to the wall. She remained absolutely still in the pitch black, just listening. The silence was louder than any knock. She sat there for what felt like an hour, the shotgun resting across her lap, her eyes trying to adjust to the deepest shadows of the room. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every creak of the house sounded like a footstep. Then, the 4th time, the knocking came again. 2 hard, impatient raps. It was a knock that said, "I know you're awake. I know you're alone. Open the door." Sarah pushed herself up, holding the shotgun tighter. She wasn't going to open the door, but she was done being silent. The fear had turned into a burning, protective rage. She walked straight up to the heavy door and, without looking through the window, screamed into the quiet house and out to the darkness. "I'm calling the cops right now. I have a shotgun, and I will blow a hole through this door if you don't leave." She paused, straining to hear any movement. "Get away from my house." The silence on the other side of the door was instant and absolute. The scuffing sound was gone. The crickets were back. Sarah waited for 10 full minutes, every muscle tense, but the knocking never came again. She called 911 immediately. After what seemed like a lifetime, 2 patrol cars finally showed up around 2 a.m. Sarah unlocked the door and let the 2 officers in, her body shaking from the adrenaline. The officers did a quick perimeter check outside. When they came back inside, one of them was holding something long and dark. "Ma'am, did this belong to you?" the officer asked, holding up a piece of thick rusted barbed wire, roughly 4 feet long. Sarah stared at it, her mouth dry. "No, absolutely not. Where did you find that?" "It was lying right here," the officer said, gesturing to the floor just outside the front door threshold. He looked at her with a grim, serious expression. "Ma'am, you did the right thing not opening this door. Whoever was out there wasn't planning on talking." He explained their theory with a chilling bluntness. The knocking was meant to lure her to the door. When she'd ask who it was, they would pretend to talk or just remain silent. She would then open the door to look around the frame, and the person, who was likely hiding low and just off to the side, would have used the barbed wire to wrap around her neck and pull her out before she could react. They had been planning to strangle her the moment she exposed herself. The police promised to patrol the area until dawn and come back for a daylight investigation. When the sun finally came up, the police returned, and what they found next was even worse. They found distinct footprints leading from the front door, around the side of the house, and stopping directly beneath Daniel's bedroom window. Along the sill of the window, they found several fresh, small nicks in the wood. The person had evidently tried to pry the window open with a tool, attempting to get into the room where all the children were sleeping, but they had failed to break the lock. It was a cold, hard confirmation of Sarah's worst fear. This was not a random intruder. This was someone who had been watching, someone who knew Michael was gone, and someone who was methodical, dangerous, and utterly depraved. Sarah never had definitive proof, but she never doubted who it was. The neighbor. He knew their schedule. He knew the second Michael's truck left the driveway, and he was always watching. They moved out of that house less than 3 weeks later. Daniel's mother never forgot the sound of that final, demanding knock, or the sight of that rusted wire, the cold physical proof of how close they came to being violently victimized in their own home. It's a terrifying reminder that some of the scariest threats aren't shadows or monsters, but the quiet, dangerous people who live right next door. The neighbor's hole. Tim's story starts 5 years ago. He and his wife lived next door to Charles and Kathy. They were typical neighbors, friendly enough, occasional backyard barbecues. Then the unimaginable happened. Charles and Kathy's 14-year-old son went missing. It was a nightmare that played out in the local news. The missing posters, the police searches it, tore the neighborhood apart. Tim and his wife tried to be supportive, but as the years went by without a word, the sadness settled into a grim acceptance. The son was gone. Charles and Kathy changed naturally. Kathy became withdrawn, barely spoke. But Charles, whom they called Charlie, became intensely awkward and nervous. He seemed to be constantly on edge, like a man waiting for a blow he knew was coming. Tim and his wife just attributed it to the trauma of losing a child. They had no idea how wrong they were. Fast forward to last week. Tim was out by his driveway dragging the garbage bin to the curb when Charles walked over. He looked exactly the same, maybe a little more weary than usual. "Hey, Tim," Charles said, fiddling with his hands. "Look, I know this is random, but could I borrow a shovel? My old one broke." "No problem, Charlie," Tim said. He didn't think twice. Neighbors borrow things all the time. He grabbed his best digging shovel and handed it over, not bothering to ask what a 56-year-old man needed a shovel for on a Tuesday afternoon. Charles thanked him, said he'd bring it back the next day, and then disappeared around the side of his house into his backyard. Tim went inside and headed upstairs. As he passed one of the rear windows, which offered a clear view of Charlie's backyard, he stopped. He could see Charles struggling, digging a substantial hole near the back fence line. It was big, really big, and Charles was straining clearly out of his depth. Tim, feeling neighborly, grabbed his second lighter shovel. He figured he'd lend a hand. He walked into Charles' backyard and called out, "Hey, Charlie, let me help you out. That looks like a workout." Charles' reaction was immediate and terrifyingly unnatural. He looked up, his face slick with sweat, his eyes wide and panicked. He dropped the shovel like it was a live wire and hurried toward Tim. No, Tim. It's okay. I got it. Please, just leave." Charles stammered, his voice tight. Tim was stunned. "What's wrong with you, Charles? It's not a big deal. Why are you acting like that?" Charles took a step closer, his eyes darting toward the hole and back to Tim. His face, usually just nervous, was now contorted into something cold. "I said, I will not allow you to use that shovel in my backyard. Now please." He pointed a rigid finger toward the gate. "Just leave." Stunned by the pure hostility and the bizarre panic, Tim backed away and left without another word. The interaction left a metallic taste of dread in his mouth. Tim retreated to his upstairs window, drawn by the unsettling certainty that his neighbor was hiding something. He watched as Charles went back to the hole, digging for another half hour until the pit was deep and finished. Then, Charles did something that confirmed every suspicion Tim had. He stopped digging and slowly, methodically, started scanning the neighboring houses. He was looking up high at windows checking, making sure no one was watching. Before Tim could duck, Charles' eyes landed directly on him. They held contact for a sickening second. Tim didn't wave. All he could do was casually walk away from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. Tim knew Charles was spooked now. He knew he'd wait until the cover of night. Sure enough, at 1:30 in the morning, Tim was jolted awake by a faint, rhythmic clink-thud sound, a shovel hitting dirt. The darkness was too thick to see anything from his window. Driven by a dreadful curiosity, Tim quietly dressed, snuck downstairs and slipped out the back door. The air was cold and humid. He crept to the fence, carefully stood on an overturned planter, and peered over the top. Charles was there, clearly visible in the cold moonlight, digging near the hole he dug earlier. He was focused, hunched over his work. When Charles paused and disappeared back toward his house, likely to grab something, Tim knew this was his one chance. He silently vaulted the low fence and crept toward the freshly turned earth. He dropped to his knees and looked down into the wide, dark pit. The moonlight caught something at the very bottom of the hole, partially covered by soil. It was a small piece of black plastic, thick and crinkled, protruding from the dirt, the unmistakable texture of a heavy-duty garbage bag. Tim stared at the bag. He looked back at Charles' house. Don't do it. What if it's his son? The image of the missing 14-year-old flashed in his mind. He looked at the bag again. This time, he didn't need to look any closer to know he was terrified. He made the snap decision to run. He scrambled back over the fence and slipped into his own yard. It was a good thing he did, because seconds later, Charles reappeared in his backyard. But he wasn't digging. He just disappeared behind the shed and didn't reappear for a few minutes. The next morning, the first thing Tim did was look out his window. The large hole in Charles's backyard was completely patched up. The ground was flat, covered with a scattering of leaves concealing the disturbed earth. Whatever had been there or whatever he was trying to hide was gone. Tim also noticed Charles' SUV was parked on the street, not in the driveway. He had to assume the worst, that Charles had used the cover of night to dig up the black bag, put it in the vehicle, and dump it somewhere far away. The body of his missing son. Charles never returned the shovel. Tim hasn't asked for it. The most chilling moment came yesterday, in the middle of the afternoon. Tim was walking by his window and glanced over at the house next door. Charles was standing at his own front window, the blinds slightly parted, looking directly into Tim's house. The second their eyes met, Charles violently slammed the blinds shut. Tim hasn't told his wife. He hasn't called the police. He knows if he goes to the authorities, he has to confess to sneaking into Charles' yard and spying on him at 1:30 a.m. He has no proof, just a patched-up hole, a missing shovel, and a neighbor who stares at him with the chilling knowledge that Tim knows. Now, Tim is trapped. He's living right next door to a man he suspects is a murderer, a man who knows Tim is watching. What is he supposed to do with a secret like that? If you were Tim, knowing your neighbor saw you watching the night he was moving something, what would be the first step you'd take to ensure your family's safety? Behind the blinds. When Noah moved into his new place, he was just looking for a fresh start. He didn't go into the details with anyone, but a bad situation with an ex had made staying in his old city impossible. He'd run into some money early in life and made bad decisions about the kind of women he surrounded himself with. Lesson learned. The neighborhood Noah moved to was really nice, low crime, quiet, mostly families. The houses were spaced far apart, which was part of what drew him there. But for some reason, the property next to his was much closer than most of the other properties were to each other. And that house next door was huge. When he first saw it, Noah thought it could easily fit a family of 10. That's honestly what he assumed at first. A big family lived there, grandparents and all. But he couldn't have been more wrong. Even though Noah tried to be low-key, he wasn't going to be a rude neighbor. He took it upon himself to introduce himself to everyone in the neighborhood. For whatever reason, he decided to introduce himself to his next-door neighbors last. He couldn't explain why. Everyone else he met seemed really sweet and genuine. He'd say 90 of them were parents of young children. And yes, they were all slightly intimidating, purely based on how successful they seemed to be. Noah wasn't too sure how a younger guy like himself would blend into a community like that, but that was more of a personal concern. When he finally got around to meeting his next-door neighbor, his social battery was mostly drained from a day of making small talk with strangers. He knew that if he went straight back home, he'd never be as motivated to meet them, so he sucked it up and walked up their driveway. He had gotten accustomed to being greeted by someone middle-aged, so when a young-looking man in a mullet opened the door, Noah was taken aback. The guy looked even younger than him, which was definitely a shock. Noah recovered quickly and launched into his new-to-the-neighborhood spiel. As he went on, the man flashed a massive smile and actually cut him off before he could finish. "Oh, wow. Someone born in my decade. What a nice surprise," the man said. Noah laughed and told him the same thing, venting about how out of place he felt as a single guy in his late 20s among so many families with kids. The man told him not to worry, that most people there kept to themselves, which was kind of a relief. He introduced himself as Damon and told Noah he should come by for a drink sometime. Noah shrugged and said, "Hell, why not right now?" expecting him to laugh and invite him in. Instead, Damon looked over his shoulder as if scanning his living room, then turned back and said he wished he could but was busy working. Noah asked him what he did for work, a normal follow-up to what Damon said. Damon's smile dropped a bit. After a weird stare, he laughed and just said, "Finance," without elaborating, which Noah thought was strange. Noah told him fair enough and asked if he had any roommates. To his surprise, Damon said he lived there alone, which seemed insane given how big the house was. They chatted for a few more minutes and Damon gave Noah his number before going back inside. Noah was excited that someone his age lived there. Damon seemed chill, but he couldn't get over how odd it was for someone like that to live alone. And yes, Noah was doing something similar, but his house wasn't even half the size. Noah went back home and got on with his life. That was about 6 months ago. For a few weeks after that, nothing eventful happened. He texted Damon a few days after getting his number to set something up, but Damon always complained about being busy and apologized for not being able to hang out. Eventually, Noah gave up. Not in a hostile way, just a you do you kind of way. Noah never saw anyone coming or going from Damon's place. No visitors, no parties, no girls, nothing. Damon never even got takeout delivered, which was strange since his car was always in the driveway. Noah genuinely didn't know what Damon ate because he never saw him leave the house. The guy lived like a ghost. Noah worked from home, and his office on the 3rd floor overlooked Damon's property. If anyone wondered how he knew so much about Damon's habits, he knew it sounded obsessive and a little creepy, but Damon's house was just a glance away from his monitor, so he couldn't help but look over from time to time. One Wednesday night, Noah woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of loud music. He slept with his windows open, so that's probably how he woke up so easily. At first, He thought he was imagining it or it was part of a dream, but he was wrong. He got out of bed and peeked out his window. 7 or so cars were lined up in Damon's driveway. No mistaking it, Damon was having a party. Noah wasn't the type to complain about noise. He'd been to his fair share of house parties, but this was the middle of the week and the volume was insane. He figured he'd just go over, knock, and ask Damon to turn it down. He threw on a hoodie and walked over. It was a full-blown party, at least from outside. Noah knocked on the door, but no one answered. He pulled out his phone to text Damon, but decided against it, knowing Damon would probably ignore him and give him some excuse the next morning. He knocked harder. Still nothing. Noah reached for the handle, expecting it to be locked, but to his surprise, the door swung open. Inside, the first thing he saw was a pile of shoes in the foyer, at least 10 pairs, but something was off. There was literally no one in there. He moved further in, expecting to see people in the living room, maybe the kitchen, but it was completely empty. There weren't even drinks left out. He could hear people over the music, but then he really listened. It wasn't even music. It was a recording, a literal recording of people laughing, yelling, clinking glasses. The whole party was fake, all of it. But that didn't explain the shoes or the cars. There were people in that house. That much was certain. Noah should have turned around right then, but he needed to know what was going on. He moved discreetly until he saw a door slightly ajar. He gently pushed it open and found stairs leading to the basement. Something told him what he was looking for was downstairs. It was dark, except for a faint light coming from somewhere he couldn't see. There was no reason to go down there, he knew that, but he did it anyway. At the bottom, the light was coming from another door deeper in the basement. Noah crept closer and started to pick up another noise he hadn't heard over the music before, a heavy, rhythmic grinding like machinery or a buzzsaw. Through the crack, he saw 3 older-looking men staring at something out of view. They wore heavy-duty work clothes, protective goggles, thick rubber gloves, and work boots, even though Noah had seen all those shoes upstairs. Under different circumstances, he'd assumed they were construction workers. He wanted to see what they were looking at, but it was too far out of view. Then came the smell bleach or some kind of cleaning solution. That's what did it. Noah felt a pit in his stomach, like his life was in danger. He turned to leave, trying to be as quiet as possible. As he was finding his way back to the stairs, the light behind him dimmed, like someone had shut the door. He didn't hear it over the music, but he felt it. Noah sprinted up the stairs, ran through the house, and burst out the front door. He didn't run directly to his house. He jumped his own fence and made it to the backyard, slipping in through his side door and locking it behind him. His chest was pounding, but under no circumstances could he let Damon or those other men know he'd been snooping. He gathered himself, went up to his office, turned off the lights, and crouched below the window, peeking over at Damon's house. There was no one there. Then, a few minutes later, the front door flew open, and about 8 guys poured out, scanning the yard, driveway, and street. Damon wasn't with them. A few looked like they were arguing, but Noah couldn't make out what they were saying. One even shoved another, and Noah thought they were about to fight, but they didn't. Eventually, they all went back inside, and the music stopped soon after. Noah stood at the window trying to make sense of what had just happened. He thought about calling the cops, but what would he even say? The music was gone, and there was no real crime he could report. He couldn't understand how none of his neighbors had a problem with the loud music, especially since most had children. He figured if they hadn't heard it and he called the police, Damon would know it was him. And the shoes, he had no idea. The men he'd seen wore boots. Did they bring extra shoes just to leave in the foyer? Noah had too many questions and no answers, so he went to bed. The next morning, he looked out his bedroom window. Every single car was gone, including Damon's. Days passed. Damon didn't return, or at least his car didn't. Noah, baffled, eventually asked a few neighbors if they'd heard the party. No one knew what he was talking about, even after he explained which house and how late it was. He thought he was going crazy. That was a few months ago. Damon still hadn't returned. The grass was long and a pile of packages leaned against his front door. Noah didn't know what to make of it. It could be nothing, but he felt no one would go to such lengths to disguise what they were doing with a fake party unless it was something illegal. But would people going to such lengths really forget to lock the front door? Maybe that's what those guys had been arguing about. Noah had no idea. The fact that none of his other neighbors seemed bothered made him think he was involved in some huge conspiracy. He knew he was probably being paranoid, but he had so many unanswered questions. When Damon returned, if he ever did, Noah debated whether or not he should just go and straight up ask him.